1989. And as part of my job, I get to travel a lot and see cars for sale and seek them out all over the world. Hi. And I've traveled about 150,000 miles a year in that pursuit for the last 25 years. So millions of miles on the road chasing cars down in lots of different countries and lots of different languages and lots of different situations. And one of the things I notice about the market right now is that it seems to feel like it's in a place that I think it's been before. Not as far as the numbers that are going on right now. The numbers are never seen before numbers, higher numbers. But I've seen this kind of a crescendo before where it really feels like something's going to happen. In times past, the market has collapsed and things become much, much more affordable. So it's a tenuous time to be dabbling in the market to a certain degree, but it's also kind of an exciting time because there's numbers that have never before been seen. There's people who are now much more interested in the industry and the hobby than ever before. There's this huge wave of individuals that come in every year to Barrett Jackson and auctions like that where they spend unbelievable amounts of money on cars coming from backgrounds that are very limited. And what we see right now, similar to the late 80s, is a lot of people investing in automobiles because they're not seeing returns on their other investments. And so they pulled their money out of the stock market or out of other ways to put their money. There's been a more typical way to do it. And they're investing in fine arts. And the most interesting news about that, I guess, recently is in the last 2 days, Sotheby's, the large auction house, has just announced that they have come together with RM Auctions, an auction company that's been around for about 25 years, based out of Ontario, Canada, which is really one of the mega lists, one of the biggest ones in the industry, one of the best ones. And they bought 25% interest in them. And so previously, Sotheby's and Christie's alike, the two biggest, most well-known auction houses for fine arts, have passed out of the collector car market because one sale for Impressionism in New York, for example, Impressionist paintings, one sale, one painting would be more than a whole year's worth of collector cars sales. And in the last couple of years, they've come to this program where they try to make cars be considered artwork. And at a very recent sale in New York for RM and Sotheby's, when they went together, they were able to raise $50 million by selling a couple dozen cars as art itself. So it's transcending a little bit more where people are looking at it not just from the point of view of a collector who wants to go out and drive the car, but also an investment and one that should withstand more time. So kind of the topic tonight is, where is the collector car market? Is it going to keep going strong as strongly as it has been? At what point will it taper off? And the answer is going to be very questionable because it depends on where the car is and as far as value goes. For affordable cars, it's in a very different place than it is for very valuable cars. So we'll kind of take a look at that. And what I've set up here is results from the last few auctions that we've been to. In fact, it's almost 10 auctions, which represent a lot of cars, hundreds of millions in sales. And it's kind of fun to look at those first. And when I look back and think about what some of these cars used to cost, where they're at right now, it's unfathomable to me, really. But this is a very interactive thing. We're a small group, so let's address anybody's thoughts or questions as we go as well. And one of the things that is really important is trying to keep your apples and apples together. One of the mistakes a lot of people run into in evaluating market results is condition. And they'll look at a car and they'll say, my God, that car just sold for so much money. My car must be worth that much as well. And there's a very, very, very deep difference in the condition of a Concours quality car versus a driver car. And sometimes it's exponentially different in the value or the cost to take it to that level. And so a lot of times consumers or collectors have a hard time realizing their car isn't quite as nice as the one that brought the world record or for that sort of a reason. And so it's important to kind of get a scale that you can go ahead and evaluate them by.
Do you think original cars will ever be worth what historic cars are?
Well, there is a newer fondness for original cars. In Pebble Beach, in the last 5 years, Pebble Beach Concours d'Elegance being the most prestigious, generally considered the most prestigious Concours car show in the world, now has a preservation class. Right. And the oldest saying in the book is you can only be original once, you can't replicate originality. So for some cars, without a doubt, the originality is more valuable. The example that comes to mind, which was really heartbreaking, was a very good friend of mine, Bill Seri from Merchantville, New Jersey, used to have an incredible Alfa Romeo 8C 300B, 2900. It was the big motor that was the old Phil Hill race car that had done all sorts of incredible events. Had the original interior, had this old paint job on it. He died of a tragic medical mistake. The one wrong with him, he died young, and he had a Bugatti collection, a lot of other cars that were very original. For him, that was a super important thing. And when his estate was being settled, Ralph Lauren bought that car. And Ralph Lauren took the car down to bare nuts and bolts. It's the most desirable Alfa Romeo in the world. And he took that car that he probably paid $4 or $5 million for it and redid every nut and bolt on it. And in so doing it, in many of our eyes, certainly mine, he ruined it. It was a really big disappointment that he did that to that car. It wasn't replicable. It was such a piece of history. It was in such great condition. So, in my mind, originality in that kind of a car, especially a car that's a race car, or that has that provenance and has the flame burn down the side of it from whatever it did, I think that's more valuable than restoring. But that's a really difficult question, and it's to each his own. Some people just can't tolerate not having something perfect. For me, perfect scares me. You know, I don't feel like I can. I'm intimidated by it. And I have people who work for me and with me, and somehow something always happens to those perfect cars, and it's heartbreaking. So here's the basic 4 out of the 6 options. What's missing here? There's also silver. Sorry?
Mecum.
Well, no, Mecum wasn't that. I have a separate one for Mecum. So this is actually Scottsdale, is what this is. But I'm missing, oh, it's Russo and steel and silver, but I sold the results coming. So this is the big crazy super snake that brought the big money out of that guy's personal collection, the Laurent Pratt collection at Barrett Jackson. Barrett Jackson has very strange results based upon what they want to support, because they're such an incredible dynamo, they're so powerful in marketing, that you can actually get a really good buy at Barrett Jackson if you're watching for a sleeper, because they have so many cars. But this Ron Pratt collection brought absurd results, absurdly high, and cars that were part of that collection didn't really do that well. And he had purchased this car a couple years before from Shelby directly, who was there on stage in my recollection. $5 million. This thing he lost a little bit of money on compared to what he paid for it. But then, at the end, 20 guys got up on stage and donated $100,000 to the military. 150 or 100, you know, they just kept on throwing money up there. So at the end, it was a little over $4 million that all went to this charitable deal. They made 10 of these feature liners or something like that. And this one brought a record when it sold a few years before to Pratt. So this Pratt collection, with all these cars, he bought from Barrett Jackson, and they ended up, I think he did pretty well with his money by the time everything sold. Now this wasn't a Pratt collection car. This is a Taboado T26 Grand Sport, bodied by the French coach builder of Frenet. It's not the most sexy body you've ever seen on those cars, but Barrett Jackson really got behind it and promoted it, and that's a very good result for that car. As is this, you'll find that we have a bunch of Cobras in there. It will show you, I think, that when somebody's a flavor of the month and really popular and is doing very well, they all start coming out of the closet, and people really jump on the opportunity. Perfect example would be the 300 SL Going. Those cars weren't bringing anything close to $1 million a few years ago, and then an alloy body one brought over $1 million, and some of the public was confused by that, and they paid nearly that much for a regular steel body car. This is a super desirable car. It's got the wrench wheels, most likely has the deli pans on it, which is the top equipment you want for that car. And everybody's always wanted one. They've grown up dreaming about them, sort of thing. But they have gone in the last 3 years from a $300,000 to $450,000 car to routinely bringing $1 million now, over and over and over again. And I saw it happen with this alloy car, which belonged to a local Seattle guy, Ken McBride. And then all of a sudden, people were paying crazy crazy money for this. It's sort of like when the Steve McQueen 911 sold for a lot of money, and everybody else started following suit. This car, for example, again, a really surprising result. It's a Cabriolet B, so that the hard top or the soft top stays up high. It doesn't collapse. And for a smaller bore Mercedes of that year, I was surprised by that strong of a result for it. I would have guessed $600,000. But this is a car that Barrett Jackson really got behind for some reason. And I think the reason, quite frankly, is I think they owned it. This is again on the Ron Pratt collection. This is a takeoff on a Delahaye. It was a Boyd Coddington or some other special designer's take on it. And it's actually a really beautiful execution of it.
There's no fiberglass on this one's fiberglass.
I think it's steel, isn't it?
They said fiberglass, and I thought that was a lot of money for fiberglass.
I think it's steel. They made a really big deal. I didn't look at it this year. I looked at it 5 years ago when it first came out, and I thought it was, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, this
is not my strength whatsoever. My strength is European cars, so I'm the first to admit when I'm wrong about that. But I mean, I know enough to pay attention to certainly that point. This is an interesting result. This car was Reggie Jackson's, and Reggie is known for not just his accolades with sports, but also for working with collector cars, but to some degree, a little bit nefariously. He had a lot of them burned and disappear, and had some kind of bizarre situations happen where there are big insurance claims. This particular car had a frame damage to it, or it had a blemished title. So actually, this is a very low result for the 40. It was an expensive car at Barrett Jackson comparatively, because they don't have that many cars that go to the 6 and 7 digits, but you know, compared to how many cars they have at their sale. 300S Cabriolet, they also made an SC, which is more desirable. They only made 57 of those. They probably made a couple hundred of these. Note that the top doesn't fully go down into it. They didn't make one in the 300 series that did, but that's, you know, 10 years ago that car was 250 to 300,000. So it's come up, but it doesn't compare to what, for example, the Goldwing does. In fact, it's much rarer. That's an early one. Sotheby's, the cover car there is a 250 Le Mans Ferrari. And Ferraris are really one of the most incredible gains in value. The last time we saw this, Enzo Ferrari had just died, and it was the late 80s, and the market just went through the roof on them. $63 million in sales and $10 million an hour.
Do you think Ferraris will hold their value?
Well, the Ferraris that will hold their value in my mind are front-engine 50s and 60s Ferraris without a doubt. So this 250 LM, I don't recall the history of it. I think it probably was the Filippinetti Scuderia real race car. They're all race cars. There's only a couple dozen 250 Le Mans cars made. There's one or two of them with pretty dubious backgrounds. One of them caught on fire and was really just a wreck. And a friend of mine bought it a few years ago, and I think he probably paid $700,000 for it. So these were trading in the $2 million mark, and that's the kind of difference they're looking at now. And you're going to see some here that I used to own some of these cars for a couple $100,000. They're bringing millions of dollars now. So the numbers of the Ferrari stuff is just out of this world. And so if you can get yourself into something in that price range, you know, you can buy that 275 GTB 4 cam. We'll see a couple more 2 cams that look nearly identical. That's one of the quintessential best looks you'll ever see on a Ferrari. It's one of the most sought after. They had real problems with vibration on they had the later torque tubes were the ones that were better with the drive shafts, but they were generally, the 4 cams were hard to keep in tune. That's got the Barani, or the Chromodoras on there, so you know, that's a good road-going car. $3.6 million, it used to be $350,000 in 1990, it was $1 million in 1988, and most recently, you know, $1.5 million 2 or 3 years ago. There was one at Club Auto, which became the LeMay facility over in Kirkland that had been there for years. It belonged to a guy, Peter, who bought the car brand new, a maroon one, sat there for years and years. We'd offer him $350,000, he won $450,000. It was always another $100,000. Well, it's now worth 10 times that much. Daytona Spider, a fairly common car. You would recognize it from Miami Vice if you used to watch that, or from other stuff that they used one of these in the Cannonball Run, I think. I had a yellow one in my store that belonged to the guy who's the chairman of National Rent-A-Car. We sold it to a collector out of Hawaii. I bought it in Oklahoma at auction from the Lake Auction Company for $349,000 7 years ago. They've gone from being $1.5 million to $3 million in 1 year. So here's a regular 275. It's just a 2-count, it's not a 4-count. It's just $1 million shy of the other car. That's absolutely a little bit of a difference there used to be. It used to be kind of 2 for 1 for the 4-count. They also made this in a 6-car version setup, which was actually the best way to get the car because the 4-counts were pretty hard to keep tuned, I think. This is a later series GTO. The early GTOs held the world record in 1989. The guy that I worked for sold one for $15 million. The original GTO. Nick Mason of Pink Floyd has one, and there was one that recently transacted. I think it might be the world record for like $33 million. This is the later one, which looks like a Ferrari 308 series car, but it's the actual GTO, which is very, very rare. You know, that's an astounding result. The last time I think we tried to trade one of those was like $400,000 or $500,000 about 3 years ago. So you see all these top sellers of these Ferraris. I mean, they're just flying out the door. 275 GTS, they made maybe 150 of them or 100. I had a 330 GTS in my store just a few years ago. The guy was an FBI agent who owned it. He'd owned it for 30-some years. I mean, they used to be a car that basically a normal person could go out and buy. This car would have been a $380,000, $400,000 car 3 or 4 years ago, and there you're looking at $2.3 million. Again, to get it to this quality is not like just an average one of the 3. They're going to be absolutely phenomenal, but Lamborghini Miura, really one of the best, earliest supercars of all time. This is the top of the line, the SV, and the J means Yoda or Joda, which is the high performance one that would be just one more level higher. This is the absolute most desirable trim you could get for this car, and the pricing is representative of it. That's really a very impressive number they got for it. 250 California Spider, or 250 GT Cabriolet Series 2. When it's got the open headlights like that, they made one of the Series 1 and covered headlights like the California Spider that we'll see a photo of later that was the barn find. $1.8 million, I'm dating myself, but half a dozen years ago, these were $250 grand. So you think about the return you could have made if you put that away, it's pretty impressive.
Evan, do you think that simply, I mean, the rarity of the Ferraris is what's driving the prices? I mean, you're not seeing a lot of American-made cars that are getting that kind of money.
Well, American-made, we'll see a little bit of that in Mecum. And American cars don't have that same cachet, and they haven't traditionally been the world record cars that bring that kind of money. It is scarcity. There's certainly lots of American cars that are super rare. And you know, the Tucker, for example, that was a huge gain in that car in the last few years. It went from being a $300,000 to $1 million car within a year or two, when all of a sudden, you know, one of the things is one car does not the market make. So one sale can't definitively always change something like that. Someone can pay too much, someone can get a great deal. But when you're talking about such a scarcity, such few numbers of cars, sometimes you really can't influence it that much. And it's just supply and demand. What I think has happened with Ferraris is I think that people who are investing in cars as an investment are investing in them. I don't think it's necessarily people who are enjoying them as much. And I think that's part of what you're competing with here, is if you're a car guy, you're competing with somebody on Wall Street. And there's actually funds out there. We at Lucky Collector Car Auction sold that Maserati Mistral barn find for a world record price. And the guy who bought it owns an antique auction company, and he bought it with a consortium of guys who's buying all kinds of cars, and they're saying, this car is going to be worth more tomorrow. We're buying this car today. So you're ending up getting into competition with people like that who are betting on that sort of stuff. It's hard to imagine people getting in these cars and driving them. But they do, and they'll take them around the track at Laguna Seca or other places and do it, and you say to yourself, well, what happens if you hit a car or you hit something and you lose all that money? But in fact, for $1,650,000, you can replace almost anything on that car, and even though it will have lost some of its originality, there's workmen who can bring that thing back to life, and it won't cost that much to fix it. So when you're driving a multi-million-dollar car, you're not really exposing multi-millions to it, you're exposing the cost of restoring it completely, if that makes sense. So, not to waste tons of time on all this stuff, but a 904 Carrera, I would have thought of that being a $600,000 to $1 million car, and they haven't appreciated like the Ferraris have, but super, super rare. Gooding is the former, back when Christie's had, this is a California Spider, by the way, 250 GT California Spider with covered headlights. When Gooding used to be the head auctioneer for Christie's when they did cars, and then he moved to RM and had kind of a political differentiation with the head of RM, Rob Meyer, and so he set up his own company a few years later, and they have the contract with Pebble Beach, and he's very, very good. In some ways, he's the top of the pile, but RM just has more options and more money behind them, especially now that they've come together with Sotheby's. But still, very impressive sales, $51 million. One of the things that happens if you go to RM or if you go to Gooding is that you have very little control. Unless you have a 7-digit car or something that is just extraordinarily desirable, you're either going in there no reserve or they're just not going to pick you. You're just not going to be able to bring your car there. $7.7 million for a long wheelbase 250 GT California Spider. Ferrari Super Americas for many years were not particularly followed. This is an early one. They didn't make very many of them. They have grown from a $400,000 car 5 years ago to $4 million for that car. That's one of the most elegant ones that there is. There's only handfuls of them. This is the car we used to have in our store, not this exact car, but a very similar car to that. They made 100 of these 330 GPSs. With Ferrari Mango, and I'm sorry we're focusing so much on, they just happen to be these heavy priced cars, but 330 is the dimension of the bore of one cylinder. So if you multiply 330 times 12, you get the size of the motor. And that's the way they did it back then for the size of the motors. The 246, the 330, the 275 is always all the basis of that. 906, that's a 6-cylinder version of like that 904 before the Porsche. Again, super rare. My car looks pretty darn correct to me. 250 GT Lusso, another strange anomaly in the Ferrari thing in that car could have been purchased for $400,000 3 or 4 years ago, and now it's almost $2 million. Absolutely beautiful, but they've got this straight axle. It's only a 3-liter motor. It's just an absolutely gorgeous design, but it's not a great car to drive. This car, a year ago, I sold one to one of the top dealers in Germany who had a Swiss buyer. It's not this exact car, but I sold mine. It belonged to Joe Diamond, the third of the Diamond family from the parking concern here. And his grandfather gave it to his dad, who gave it to him, and he didn't even drive a stick. He'd had the car for 30 years and had never driven it. So my mechanic used to work on it for him. I found a buyer, $1,050,000. It was a world record price, and it all was done in a year. Elvis had one of these cars. They were pretty rare, and they're really beautiful, beautiful car with an aluminum V8 almost American for you, Stacy, but English body. $24 million, half as much as the Gooding sale, but still pretty impressive. $24 million is nothing to shake a stick at. That looks like a 275 competition car. Very similar to a GTO. 75 Competizione Coupe. Another Gullwing for 1.3. That one doesn't even have the Rudge wheels. The Rudge wheels bring it up about 50 or 75,000. That's a huge result for a standard Gullwing. 300 SL Roadster 1.2. I was in Argentina 6 months ago, and there was a totally original 300 SL Roadster. The paint, they buffed it so much it was down to the primer in a couple places on it. The interior was totally original on it, but it was really a lovely car. That's got the Rudge wheels on it. But then they had photo documented the complete restoration of the running gear, taking it down to bare nothing. Absolutely spectacular car in my mind. They wanted $800,000 and just thought, you know, they'll never bring that. And here it is, less than a year later. And they are bringing that. That's the coupe version of the Daytona Swag we saw earlier. They were 125 grand before. Finally, we got that weird French car. This is a Type 57, which is one of the most prolific of all the Bugatti cars ever made. I think they made 500 of them in different configurations. And they sold for $7 or $8 million, depending on if they're supercharged and what the body looks like.
So Evan, what do you think the motivation is for people to put consign their cars in an auction?
American cars, they
No, what do you think why do you think they put them in auctions instead of doing private sales?
The motivation, you know, depends on these auctions, and you know, we can kind of get to that because we're going to get a little bit more down to earth here in a second. The motivation, obviously, with these auction companies is that you're going to get a lot of money. The cost to do it is getting the car there. You take a big risk on a lot of them because they won't, if they're going to take your car, they're going to put you in a position where you're going to agree to sell it for a very reasonable price. They only have a certain amount of time to promote your car. They're very good at it. This is the Mecca in Scottsdale, Arizona. That week is, all the people come out for it. But for example, if you want to put this car in there, a 300S coupe, you would most likely have to do that no reserve, and you spend $1,000 to $1,500 getting into the sale. You pay them their seller's fee, and the buyer pays a big commission. The buyer pays 15% on the first 100, and I mean, they're very expensive fees involved with it, but they do a great job promoting it. Here's the Kissimmee Mecum auction. They're calling themselves the world's largest collector car auction. I mean, I don't know, maybe just a number of cars, I suppose that might be true. So it's the week after Barrett Jackson and all the other ones. And of course, all their top results are definitely American. Heavy Daytona. And they have a Prevost coach in there, which is kind of photos for a ringer. 350 fastback, that's huge. So they do very well. I mean, Mecum does do very well. They're kind of a bizarre auction company because, in these sorts of cars, they probably would spend a bunch of money promoting them, but they don't do a whole lot for the average car. It sits in the block for 3 minutes and it's gone. And they make their money at entry fees and just their sheer volume. So every time something does sell, they're delighted, but that's not their business model. It's not the same. And they don't put the same sort of effort into client relations that you'll get from some of the other bigger ones. So here's the France stuff, which is a little bit different. And again, some of the feeling from my colleagues was that some of the numbers were actually starting to kind of taper off. So we're looking at just the high-end stuff because there's so much data that I can't share everything with you. So it may be leading us a little bit astray because we keep I'm looking at Ferraris and things. That's a Ferrari Lusso again. These guys did $21 million in sales. Top price was an $18 million barn find that didn't even run. And 5 of them over $1 million. So the Lusso 1.8, I think we saw one was 2.3 before. That's about the same number for the 904 we saw before. That's a strong number for a 300 SL Roadster. F40. Iso Grifo, that's very, very rare version of that with the Sternale setup. A regular Iso Grifo is like a $350,000, $400,000 car. That one looks a lot like a Bizzarini. So that's the sleeper car that was originally Jane Fonda's and her husband Roger, somebody or another. And it was sitting in this industrialist garage along with 50 other cars. And their initial photos they have of it, they have a pile of recycling on top of the hood. So it's got old newspapers and magazines and stuff. They've been sitting there for decades. They had a really wonderful way they displayed it in Paris under lights, and it was very, very, it was like being in a haunted house when you came in there. And just the way that they had the whole thing laid out was very Parisian, very well thought out.
Didn't they leave all the dust and everything in all those cars?
That not totally, but you know, you can see they didn't buff it out or anything. But the way they presented it was super cool.
So they got 18.7 for that?
Yeah, I think that's right. 18.5. You know, when you saw, right? The other one was restored. It was less than that.
Yeah. Was it because Jane Fonda owned it, or?
I don't think so. Although there's a really sexy photo of her with the guy Roger Vadim or something in her original husband. Just a great photo of them in LA with the palm trees and stuff. I mean, they found all the pretty stuff to go with it. But I think it was because, as the French would say, it's dans son jus. It's all in its own juices. So it's just kind of, I think it was because of the mystique of what it was today. And you'll see a few of these other cars that are just outrageous. That was the second highest one, the A6G. You know, that's, you can see, Stacy, that's got the dirt all over the windshield still. That was not one of the cars out of that collection, but that was. And you look at that, remember that other Talbot we saw earlier, I said, well, that front end body's not that sexy. Well, this one's an incredibly interesting body on it, Salchick. Holy cow, $2 million for what's that? I mean, you know, that's a lot of work. You're not going to leave that one like it is, you know.
So, and what's a car like that worth after it's been restored?
Well, I mean, that's new territory, because that car has never, no one's ever paid that much for a car that looks like that. Do you remember that Bugatti? you know that Bugatti that they found? It was on the cover of Sports Car Market. There was a Bugatti, an early race car. They're called a Brescia, and it was found in a lake in Italy. Remember that one? And that's in the museum, Peter Mullen's museum. He just took over the Peterson Museum because he was the only alive board member, and Margie Peterson died, Bob Peterson died, so now he's moving his stuff all over the Peterson Museum in LA. But that's one of his prizes. Well, he's leaving that car like that, just totally falling apart with, you know, being drug out of being in a lake for decades. So that car will not stay like that. I'm prepared to bet very strongly that it will go to Lecoq or one of the top European guys to redo it. I bet they're going to try to say it's worth $6 or $7 million when they're done, and they'll spend $1 million on it, getting it to the right point. But so much of it won't be original. That seems like a lot to spend on something that wasn't quite right. This is a similar result if you think about that one back to Barrett Jackson, which was 1.1 that I thought was kind of overpriced. This is a bigger motor. It's of a 320, and it's also got the supercharger on it. It's a way better car to drive. Bonham's got world records on Aston Martins. Aston Martins are another brand that's through the roof. That car, I remember when it would have been $300,000. There it is, 2.1. Very few. DD5s, cabriolets, you know. You keep getting the words I can't get, thank you. This was a very, very famous Russian former diplomat who owned this car and raced the pants off of it, so it kind of had a neat history with him as well. Sorry, I didn't mean to skip by that. AC. This is not a particularly high result for an Minnesota Freshie. This is kind of like we were talking about earlier, cars that don't really get a whole lot of money. Some of the classics people don't step up for them like they did. I mean, that may be a niche in the collector car market right now that's a good place to buy. This has always been an unbelievably revered brand. Driving one is like driving a bread van. They're not very comfortable and not very easy to negotiate, but they're absolutely drop dead sexy. If you remember I'm ready for my close-up, that Sunset Strip movie, the guy, he's dead in the pool at the beginning and he was...
Sunset Boulevard.
Sunset Boulevard, yeah. So anyways, that's the car that we drive around with Masada Fresh and Tipo 8A. And this is as cool as it gets, this particular model. So I'm actually, if I was buying $1 million car, I think that would have been a bargain when you compare it to what some of those relatively common Ferraris are bringing. By comparison, there's a half dozen of those in the world. This guy owned 3 of them, and he was trying to get off of them. I had an outstanding ad going in Hemmings all the time looking for one. I just didn't happen to have $1 million to buy it with. And so he called me a while ago, and I could hear his wife nagging him in the background. It was trying to get a little liquidity, and I think that's probably why they let it go at that price. Here's a more realistic price for an F40. They're worth less in Europe than they are in the US. But remember, Reggie's was wrecked. So that's my slides. So that's kind of, I mean, where I see the market right now, I see that there is some slowdown. I see that a lot of the cars that are super popular, like the high-end Porsches, the high-end Ferraris, the high-end Mercedes, have drug up their little brothers and sisters where they're really, really popular right now too. And so the stuff that seems to just be leaping off the shelves is air-cooled 911s, 356 Porsches,
Dinos.
Ferrari Dinos are $400,000.
Expensive.
You know, and again, that's just, you know, such a silly result. They're more than a Boxer, which is twice the car. And they're very similar designing to them. Aston Martins are extraordinarily sought after, and the prices being paid for them are very, very high. At Barrett Jackson and Miko, sometimes you can find those cars that aren't bringing big money because they don't have the European interest as much from people buying them there. I saw a 280 SL sell for $40,000 at Barrett Jackson, which is probably a $100,000 car in today's market. So there are still some very good buys that you can make. You can, you know, if you're thinking about selling a car, it is a particularly good time. I would not recommend putting it into a sale like Barrett Jackson where you go no reserve. That can be very dunning and you know, it's one thing what you see on TV, but what happens to a lot of people is very different. There's a lot of people who are pretty bummed out by the end of that experience. So, you know, how this translates to moderately priced cars doesn't seem to be, they don't seem to be nearly as strong an investment, strong as a return as the higher stuff does. The 20s cars are, 20s and 30s American cars are very, very slow, so I think it's a good time to buy that stuff. There were some Packards and things like that that I thought were really good buys at the auctions that we went to. And what we did see was a fall off on some of the prices of the stuff that's been just unbelievable. Some of the 911s, the 190 SLs weren't bringing the numbers that they had been bringing in the last few months. Jaguar E-types, the early ones with the outside bonnet latches, those slowed down a lot too. So in general, I don't think it's that much further before there will be another adjustment, maybe after tax time. Something like that might be kind of when that comes around. But
So Evan, if you were to look in like your crystal ball, you know, in like 10 years from now, are there any cars that you don't think are getting the kind of the due that do very well right now, but probably will be doing pretty well in the future in terms of their sale prices and stuff?
I think they're still undervalued cars. I had thought until recently when I was seeing the phenomenon going on with Ferrari, because it has been coming on for a while, and they are always one of people's favorites. And one of the things I said earlier was when the market is strong, anything sells. When the market's weak, the best sells. So if you're looking to do a long-term investment, buying something with the wrong motor, or there's a color change, or it's got a story, it's been in a wreck, or it's got things that just aren't copacetic about it, that's going to be the toughest to be able to long-term see a gain with. If you want to buy something that you can have confidence that you're going to get a good return on, you need to buy the very best example of something you can afford in its purest form, and be prepared to wait long-term for it. If you wait 10 years on something that isn't ridiculously overvalued right now, it's hard to think you won't do well with it. But the one thing to keep in mind is a simple rule of thumb, is that the major buyers for collector cars are men, and there are men who are retired and they're living their fantasy back to what they wanted when they were a kid. And so that's part of the reason that muscle cars have been so strong in the market, is because it's the 60-year-old looking back to what he would have bought when he was 20, when the car came out. And that is just a simple equation that seems to work year in, year out. We were talking earlier about why Model Ts are so unbelievably inexpensive, or will they ever see an upside? And in the case of the Model T, as in the case of many cars, they're so common, so well built, sold so well, that they're never going to be super rare. I mean, here it is 100 years later, they're still around. So you've got a little bit of an issue there, because it's not going to be as collectible because it's so common. So if you can find something that's not super common, the case with the Jaguar E-Type, I think it would be worth as much as most of those Ferraris, but they were so popular because of the XK120, the 140, 150, they won Le Mans 3 times or something. So suddenly William Lyons is on top of the world. He designed what Enzo Ferrari called the most beautiful car of all time, the E-Type, and Enzo's not far off because he copied it like crazy. And still being made at 240, 260, 280Z. Look to that car. That car was so spectacular, but it was really reasonably priced, and so they sold 100,000 of them. So that's why they're not spectacularly expensive. There's a perfect example for you. I had to talk for a while before I figured it out, Stacy, but I think, for example, that car, in its latest evolution, which is the V12 version, 4 inches longer, I think it's underappreciated right now. And in 1989, they were $100,000 for a really nice one. Right now, they're $50,000 for a really nice one. And it's been 20-some years. I can't believe that that car is not going to hold its own. I think that's a great investment. We have, for example, in Lucky, a one-owner example of that car, original paint, original interior that runs perfectly, that's going through, and the reserve is well under $50,000. I think that's a great buy. So something like that would be something that I would be inclined to invest in. Why is it that an Aston Martin is worth $500,000 in comparison? They don't really drive any better. They're much rarer. So some of that stuff I think is going to adjust back, but I still think there's buys there. I was really excited about a Ferrari Boxer. We compared it to Dino a second ago. Dino's a beautiful car, but it's got a little 6-cylinder 2-liter in it, or 2.4-liter. The Boxer got this huge 12-cylinder in it. It's also a rear-engine car, a mid-engine car, and huge horsepower, goes like stink, absolutely beautiful Pininfarina design. They've now doubled in value in the last year or two, but you could buy one for $100,000 a couple of years ago, now they're $200 or $250. You compare it to the Lusso that's $2 million, maybe that's an opportunity. So if you want to go back another step and look, what's something I can buy for $20,000? There's Alfa Romeo Spiders out there, the Boattail Spider like Dustin Hoffman drove in The Graduate. You can still get one of those cars, would be lovely condition for $20,000. The Sprint Speciale, kind of a strange bodied coupe, was $20,000 or $25,000 3 years ago, and they're now $80,000. You look at the car in the collection here, the little Abarth Zagato, that's a $60,000, $70,000 car that probably cost $20,000 3 or 4 years ago, something like that. So there's a lot of those kinds of things that are pretty collectible that are still out there. It depends on your interest. American cars are a bargain right now. If there's a certain type of car that you like, an old Camaro or a Mustang or a Mopar, that you can get a very high quality one that has got correct running gear and numbers matching sort of situation, you can buy your way into it. It's hard to believe that they're not going to come around because they've been soft for several years and everything else has come up. The one big exception is I can't really bet on whether or not the big 30s cars are going to be coming back up or not, because there just aren't that many people who follow them. But for my particular taste, I think they're unbelievable values. And in a situation like that, you want to buy the best one you can get because they're so expensive to redo. So again, one of the points we had earlier was that for $5,000 or $6,000 for a Model T, buying one in the secondary market, you could never get a car to run and drive for the kind of money it costs just to go out and buy it. So you never want to get so far over your head that you're buying something that if it doesn't turn around and do better, you're going to lose the farm over it. I mean, I think that's a mistake because I think a lot of people are doing that. And I think when I remember back to the 80s, originally the first thing that happened when the market collapsed was the Americans were not in for the long-term gain. And they were losing money, and so they sold their car at 20% loss, and somehow they got through that. And then 6 months went by, and the Europeans, they say they've got an old house, and they mean it, it's a 500-year-old house, not a 100-year-old house. They're much more used to the ebb and flow of economy at the time, and they just have a different outlook than Americans do. That's when they caved in, and they started selling their cars at a 40% loss from where the market was at. The Japanese, who at the time, they used to say this when it was going at auction, they're saying it's going to Japan, it'll never come back. The Japanese waited until they were taking about a 60% loss before they finally threw in the towel and were selling the cars that are coming right back over to the US again. So there will be a point when these multi-million-dollar cars take a serious adjustment, but they're always going to be more than they were at some point, and it's just, it's not a situation where I would want to be into it. It's like musical chairs the way I explain it. You don't want to be the last person standing, and I think that position is coming fairly quickly. I think it will be in the next 6 months. These are examples of people who are playing with, a couple extra digits. The stuff that we normally sell at auction is not going to be something you have to mortgage the house to have. So it's not as big a concern, but still a concern nonetheless, because you want to be able to invest in something that you're not going to lose money on. I think Austin Healey's are a good buy. I think you could probably make a good buy on Stacy's favorite car, a Nash or a Paulton right now. I think a lot of those cars are just kind of at a low spot where they are right now. And of course, it's a very seasonal thing as well. If you buy this time of year, you do better than if you buy in the middle of the summer. Or if you buy right after tax day, you should get a good deal to it. Any other thoughts, please?
Quick question, if a car's gone up in value, double or triple in value in the last 3 or 4 years, it seems like it's a good time to sell. Because you can't continue to do that.
I agree.
But who would buy it?
What kind of car in particular? What kind of brand? I mean,
Well,
there's different buyers for different markets. So, for example, the foreign stuff right now, it's a little bit tricky because our biggest buyer are the Europeans. And in the last sale we had with Lucky, we had buyers from all over the world. We sold cars to Dubai, we sold cars to Europe, and in general, Cosmopolitan sells a lot of cars to Europe. The Europeans have got a little bit of a brakes on right now because it's $1.15 to the euro, not $1.35, so it's annoying them. Well, when the euro came out, it was $1, so it's hard for us to feel sorry for them. But at the same time, it does slow that sort of stuff down. But there are still people who are convinced the market's going to continue to increase, and in fact it does. And there's people who are both investors and just guys with a lot of money who want one. And they're mostly novice, newer buyers that are leading that whole buying spree, it seems to me. There's every year at Barrett Jackson, there's 50,000 new people that I've never seen before. They come in there and spend enormous amounts of money.
well, I know realtors price houses. How do you price cars?
Well, real estate price house is based upon appraisals and upon supply and demand and upon assessors, basically, right? commercial or something like that. With cars, it's important to get it across to an individual the differentiation in condition. And most of the stuff we've been looking at is what in the industry they call jewelry. And it's so nicely done, it's so perfect, it's just above and beyond good condition. So just a nice old car that you've taken care of that's in your garage is probably a condition 3 car. A number 2 car is a brand new car, rolling off the showroom floor. A number 1 car is better than it ever possibly was, absurdly redone, to the extent that it probably cost as much to redo it as the car was worth when it walked into the facility. So lots of cars that are not bad cars are condition 4. And someone would say, you know, I've got this car, and I've seen this other one that brought this much, so my car has to be worth as much as that. But a true, serious, no expense spared collector is only going to buy the highest quality car, and the money's not the difference. To take a car from condition 2 to 1 or condition 3 to 1 is exponentially more than it is just to have that car. And so there's a lot of different factors that go into it. You've also got the time that it takes to do that. So some people want the immediate gratification. So there's enough buyers out there that mean that condition 1 car is super valuable because there just aren't other examples of it. That BMW 507, I said I sold one from the Diamond Parking family a year ago for $1 million. There aren't any other ones in the market. So you can pretty much decide how much you want for it based upon who else wants one, how many are out there, and what was the last one sold for. And so as long as you have a pretty good understanding of condition compared to another car, doing a comp for it's not that difficult. But it's often, you know, it's really hard to get through to some people that their car is just a nice, honest, original car. It's not a car that's been, you know, completely gone through a whole restoration. So evaluating a car is not that difficult. I mean, what I would do is I would look for comps and see other things that have been recent sales. But again, one sale doesn't always dictate what the market will do. It just depends on how scarce the car is, how desirable the car is. And they go in waves. There just happens to be things that people are interested in at certain times, and it does change frequently. And so someone who's in the business has got to be very, very aware of what people are buying and what people aren't buying. And that's not always something that you would predict. It surprises me, for example, that some of the micro cars are slower now than they were a couple of years ago. They were super popular then. And like Isetta, BMW Izettas are a fun little car, and 3 or 4 years ago they were more popular. A VW microbus, 23 window microbus, was more sought after a couple of years ago than it is right now. And you know, I've got to keep in mind that the cost of restoring something is as much, that people's labor is the same regardless of what the value of the car is. So a higher end car is more likely to make more money if you have to do reparations to it than a lower end car, because the cost of doing it is going to eat you up, just regardless if it's a Volkswagen or the value you're working on. Any other thoughts?
What about some of the orphan cars? Some of the entry-level cars, some of those things? I mean, what's happening with those?
They seem to be doing, I mean, I know you've got a lot of those and you're knowledgeable about them. I mean, share with me your thoughts. I think they're coming on stronger. I think that, you know, for example, here's a car that nothing's happened to it in 30 years. It was car of the year with road and driver and car and driver and road and track, the Citroen SM. Very strange car, expensive to keep on the road, loved by many and hated by more. And yet, I think those cars have doubled in value in the last year. But they haven't moved in 25 years, 1 inch. So it's very, very hard to understand that. There was a beautiful RO80 that was just for sale in St. Louis. Did you see that car? And the guy paid way too much for it, I think. He can't sell it, he's a friend of mine. But what a spectacular car. So cool, so rare, really in great condition. So who's to say what it's worth? I would have thought that was probably, you know, a German guy would buy that. So an RO80, I'm sorry, I'm throwing it into nomenclature that everybody doesn't know, but it's an NSU, which is an old German mark that was later bought by Volkswagen. And it was the first real significant production rotary car. They bought the license, when Mazda started building them, they bought the license from NSU. And NSU first had a little rotary Spider they had, a Wonka Spider. Then they later came out with the RO80, which is a sedan, but looked an awful lot like a period Audi or something like that. But had that very, very obscure rotary engine in it. And so some of the really eclectic cars that I like have never really had much of an upcoming in value. But then there's a thing called a DKW, which is a member of the four rings of what Audi later became, the four companies that formed the four rings of the auto union. DKW was a three-cylinder, two-stroke front-wheel drive car in the 50s and 60s, and they made a van version of it. And these vans have been selling for $100,000 because they're so obscure and rare, partly because they've been promoted by people like RM and Gooding. So there are all kinds of little niches there, for sure. Launches have gone through the roof recently. A launch Aurelia or the earlier cars, what am I thinking of? Well, Fulvia Zagato, or a lot of the custom built ones, but the Aurelia, the California Spider and the regular Spider, they're $400,000 or $500,000, $1 million now. They were $100,000 a couple years ago. So I agree with you. I think that's an easy place to invest because you can buy something for a few $1,000s and see what happens. We had a Honda S800 chain drive car that went through our auction last time. It was one of a couple hundred made. And it was a really astute purchase for $4,000 or $5,000. It didn't run, it needed a total restoration, but they only made 100 of these things, or a couple hundred of them. And there's somebody who's really going to covet that car at some point. So a lot of times the scarcity of the thing, if it's complete and hasn't been maligned, is a pretty good way to bet on something coming around. Early Lotus Alans and Europas, I think those are also really good cars to buy into. But you know, the market is just very, very soft with American cars in general. So if that's what your fancy is, I think you can still get a very good buy on that sort of stuff. Especially 50s cars. 50s convertibles from Oldsmobile or Pontiac or you know, the GM, other than the Chevys, the rest of that whole line of those cars, super high quality build, and they don't build as much, they don't bring as much money as a 55, 6, 7 Chevy does. So I think those are really good buys right now.
So they're nice cars, so.
They're really nice cars, yeah. High quality build.
So you're saying sell foreign and buy American?
It depends, it's got to be more specific than that. You know, I can't give you a straight answer because, you know, I don't want to lead you wrong. And one thing I would say is buy the very best you can afford to have because doing the work on it is very expensive. So unless you found something that's just such a treasure that it deserves to have a bunch of money spent on it, don't buy something that needs a restoration unless you can do it because you'll be further ahead buying something that's already done. That's just a given. And if you've got something that's foreign, that's heavily coveted right now, it's probably a good time to get off of it. If you're finding something that seems like a really good buy for something you've always wanted, buy into it. But I can't tell you something that's just an automatic money maker without being able to give, you know, look at it specifically and say, this is what you're paying for it, this is the condition of it, well that's a good buy. It's hard for me to say that without knowing more specifically what you're talking about. You know, there's certainly foreign cars that are not easy sells. If you buy a 560 SL or a XJS Jaguar convertible right now, they're really inexpensive. I don't expect that they're going to go up in value for a long time. So I wouldn't want to just say something quite that specific because I don't know that it's 100% true. But what's happening in our experience is, in general, European stuff is selling a lot more easily because the world market is absorbing them quicker. And the kinds of cars that I specialize in with my 50s and 60s big open American cars, they've been hard to sell. I've had some 30s Packards that have sold very, very slowly. I think they're wonderful cars. Beautiful big open Packard, $50,000, $60,000. Geez, it would cost $200 to restore the thing, and there's just not that many buyers for them. So in my mind, that's the car to buy. It's not just for the return, it's because at the end of the day, it's a fabulous car that you can enjoy, and it's just incomparable for the fun factor for the money. So I try to think about it in those positions too. But if you're looking at it purely from a financial financial return, you also have to think about how long you want to hold it versus whether it's something you want the liquidity from. And a car like that that's that specialized, there isn't the same kind of liquidity that you'll get from a Mustang convertible or a 69 Camaro convertible. So the more popular the car is, the more liquid the car is, the less likely you're going to make a big gain on it. You're going to make a smaller gain, but it's going to be more protected. And the bigger gain comes from something really eclectic where you hang out on the side of the road and find something really bizarre, and it turns out to be something where someone really wants. But sticking within your own genre with something that you're comfortable with, that you understand, is always a smart place to be.
Do you think like 450 SLs are gonna take off like 230s and 280s eventually, or?
You know, there seems to be some interest in them, but see, we're talking about early 70s, we kind of joke about them, call them Panzer tanks,
Yeah.
versions of them. The motors in those cars are as expensive as the car is, so if the motor goes out, you've got a really big anchor. The one that's valuable is the first year, the 72 350 SL, which has got the aluminum block. It's got the nimble little bumpers on it, which are much smaller. And 74, of course, DOT just took over and made the really restrictive bumpers, side markers, lights, and the higher off-the-ground profile of the car, which ruined most British cars, detuned everything, and created all the havoc for those kinds of cars in the US. So the early one, the Europeans are starting to seek. I wouldn't be surprised if they did. And if you're familiar with those cars, which it sounds like you are, the 380 SL, the mid-tier one, is really the worthless one because they have camshaft problems, transmission problems. 560s are actually a great fun car to drive, but they made so many of them.
Yeah,
It's a rule of thumb. Rule of thumb to me is always, you know, if they made a ton of them, is a Miata going to be worth a lot of money? I don't think so. You know, how about an Avanti? A Studebaker Avanti is so ridiculously underpriced. And an Avanti 2 is as much money as an Avanti 1. Go out and find yourself an R2 supercharged Avanti. We had one in our four-speed one. We had one in our sale a couple times before. The guy was totally frustrated, didn't sell for $15,000, $18,000. Raymond Loewy design, totally avant-garde. This guy was just a total trendsetter. I mean, that is just a significant car that hasn't seen an upside yet. I think that's a car that you can make money on. Studebakers are interesting because at the end they would let you build it any way you wanted to. And I have, for example, that I'm doing a restoration on it. I'm 3 years into my restoration. It's worlds to come before I'm ever going to be done with it. And I have the only station wagon they ever made from the factory. It's got this crazy roof that retracts all the way back so you can carry a refrigerator in it. That was their marketing thing. So it's a Studebaker Lark Daytona Wagoneer, so it's got all the trim things, the whole thing. It looks just like a Jeep Wagoneer if you look at the back of it. It's designed before it. It has a little swim step that pops out like on an old boat, so you can stand up into the elevator out. But the best part about it is it's the one of 10 that came from the factory with an R2 supercharger. So it was built from new with a supercharger, and it's the only one in the world with a 4-speed. So I bought that car for the original owner. He changed it from black to white. I had to turn it back to white. So I took the whole thing apart, and you know, it's in 3,000 pieces, and I've just rebuilt the motor. It's been years, and it's going to take me another few years to get it done. But that's a labor of love. It's something I like. It's from my birth year. It's just a fun car. At the end of the day, that was like a $10,000 or $12,000 car when I bought it, and it ran perfectly. I just couldn't help myself. So something like that, it's hard for me to believe that's not going to have more upside in it. It's so affordable, you can take those kinds of risks with it.
Question is, do you have the Kelvinator to put in that?
No. Yeah, I need to
You
go
gotta
find
have
it.
the Kelvinator refrigerator.
But I was going to go take it from Stacy and Tim's house because they've got everything in their new place.
How does the mileage that you put on your collector car affect the sale price?
Well, you're asking me these questions like how long is a piece of string? So I've got to, I don't know exactly, but I mean, if it's a big mile car, then it doesn't matter. If it's a super low mile car, it does. In the case of a Porsche Speedster that I just recently had, I had like 9,000 miles on it. And so hitting the 10 mark was really a big no-no thing to do. But, you know, if it's got 40,000 miles and you're putting another 4,000, 5,000 miles on it, probably doesn't matter as much. But if you can document the miles and they're super low, you know, it's great to try to keep it there because that really excites some people. But it also is kind of a crippling thing from your point of view, because if you've got a car that's got such super low miles on it, you can never really drive it without making it worth less. So to go back to the example of the 450 SL, I had probably the lowest mile 450 SL in the world. And I tried forever to sell it because I wanted a lot of money for it. It was 36 miles on it. And the guy that I finally sold it to was a Mexican guy. And I was like, are you going to put it in a museum? Or what are you going to do? It'd been in a basement in San Francisco with a franchise dealer for decades. Part of a big collection out of Tennessee that I bought it in. It's just been totally coddled all its life. He's like, no, I'm going to drive it. You know, he got the car in the So, you know, to me, that's part of the fun about it, is that it's nice to make money, but you got to remember what all this stuff is. It's their possessions and their things that are meant to be used. So it's to me, it's a little crippling to have something that's such super low miles, you can't enjoy it. It's nicer to have a little bit more flexibility with it. And that's the problem with a condition one car, is you just have to be so careful driving it. You know, park it in the back 40 so nobody will door ding it. And somehow the gnats are always attacked or attracted to it anyway, so no matter how you try to protect it, some kid's going to come over with cotton candy and drool on it. And so if you can avoid a car that's that nice, it's helpful. You're trying to maintain it. But if you do have something that's of that kind of a car that's you know, that's popular right now, I think it's a really smart time to sell it. Will the market go another 5% or 10%? Maybe, certainly in some areas, but we're already seeing some areas of slowdown too. So I think that the numbers can still be generated that are similar, maybe a little bit better to what's happened so far. But there's also examples of people holding back. And you know, one of the things people like to look at for valuations, like the Hagerty price guide, for example. It's funny you should say that, because it's another tie-in to LeMay. Dave Kinney, who started that price guide, he called it Cars That Matter. What he originally called the book, and he's from Washington, D.C. He is one of the world's experts on Avantis, and he bought the car that came out of the collection and sold at the Verona Hotel 3 or 4 years ago, which was either the first one or the last one. Which one was it?
First one.
Because the last one's still here.
We saw it. Well,
We have one or the other.
we have the first.
Okay, well he bought the last one, which came out of the collection, so he just happened to be an Avanti collector, but he started that book, and it was pretty clever, and sold to McKeel Hagerty, and that, of course, for Hagerty Insurance was just a brilliant maneuver to buy that book, because they're already so immersed in the collector car world, and they're part of all these different events, and they really do a good job of being out there and encouraging people to drive their car. What Hagerty does is they do agreed value insurance. They weren't the first to come out with that, but they're one of the best at it. And agreed value is a wonderful thing for a collector, because then you're not going to get the shortcoming of somebody else's perception of actual cash value, or diminished value for whatever reason they think that the car is not worth as much as you do. You've already agreed this is what the car is worth. So in the case of a total loss, you get that. But of course, they base your rates upon what the value is. You're paying a direct equivalent to a specific amount per dollar of coverage is what you're paying for your policy. And so it's in their best interest to evaluate the cars as being as valuable as possible, because the more valuable your car is, the more you're paying them for the premium. And so you'll find that with the price guide as being pretty optimistic. They're looking at real condition one cars. They're not looking at cars that are really in the condition that most people have their cars in. So that's just something to keep in mind when you look at that evaluator. That's a pretty technologically advanced one that people whip it up on Hagerty now and they say, well, my car is worth this much. It's worth that much if you think it's worth that much, if you want to pay them that much for your premium, because they figured out that very few people who like collector cars and own them and buy their policies ever wreck them. That they're an unbelievably low payout rate for that type of coverage. So just keep that in mind when you're doing valuations. The NADA guide and the Kelly guide are a little bit more critical evaluation than you see with the Hagerty guide. But all of those things, guide is a very proper name for it, because it's not super accurate. It's based upon information that's a few months old, and it's what their best result can be. And I'm on the board of the NATA book, and we every month turn in our results for sales, but it's not very scientific how they do it. So you still have to adjust it to kind of what the market will bear. Get a feel for that.
You see so many times in those guides, a car sits at the same price for 8, 10 years.
Right.
You know, and how can they do that? It's not realistic to what the market is.
Well, it's not, but there are some cars that really haven't moved. There are some other cars like that. Another example of that would be like the Italian-American hybrids, like that ESO.
Also,
Those cars just didn't do anything for a long time. Then suddenly the Grifos took off and they were worth $50,000, $60,000, and then they're worth $250,000. So the cars that nobody cared about, the Revolta, the Fidea, and the Lele, they all came up a little bit just because, you know, how could their cousin be worth that much money and they were worth nothing? I mean, $8,000 is what I paid for my last Lele. But, you know, nobody even knows what that car is, let alone, you know, the transactions are so few and far between. So, that's right.
you know, some of the cars like the Saabs now, what's going to happen with some of those older ones now that the company's gone?
You know, I think Peter Mullen bought the museum for the Swedes. I think he bought all those old cars. You know, they were very significant cars in their achievements. Of course, the BKW relationship to them, they were very successful in ice racing and all that and stuff like that, and in rallies, and they're pretty neat. They're just, you know, I'm sure that the Swedish people are always going to want to collect them, but other than Ballard geeks like you and me, or, you know, I don't know how many people are going to go after that sort of stuff. But for me, I'm always interested in something that's very different. It's not, I don't share the mainstream taste of everybody in general. I don't think that there's that many people who are going to follow them. I don't think, you know, Saab Sonic, for example, is their sports car. The early one with the 3-cylinder 2-stroke is pretty highly sought after. The Series 2, Series 3s, they're really inexpensive for what they are, seems to me.
Is there any kind of a breakout point where a 10-year-old car is worth 50% new and a 30-year-old car is worth twice what it was paid for? Is it really?
You know, again, it just depends on the car. Let's look at the Ford GT, which is only about 10 years old now. Is that right? When did they come out? 2005? Is that right? So that car, it went down a little bit in price for a couple of years, and then all of a sudden, it's way back up, it's way more again. So that car was such limited production that, you know, one couldn't really speculate and guess on that. But I was kind of marveling at that myself today. A friend of mine was saying, where can you get me a perfect TR4? And I sat there and muddled the thought for a while, and I thought, well, my old housemaster at my boarding school in Victoria bought his brand new. He's 85, it's got 40,000 miles on it, and it's still there. You know, he still polishes it, takes care of it. So I sent him an email and said, do you want to sell it? And told this friend of mine, who's a very well heeled collector in Kauai, I said, you know, I can maybe get you this great car for 40,000 miles, $40,000. You know, he paid $2,000 or $3,000 for the car. So, you know, that's something that's pretty spectacular. But most people can't take care of a car like that or have that little miles on it for that long. And that's just, you know, that's a very strange example of that sort of thing. And my experience, I keep a car for 10 or 15 years. It just never looks as good as some people. I have a really hard time I'm so impressed by people who can do that. There's a woman today who could sign a car to us for our sale coming up, and we're lucky because we have a huge amount of cars with no reserve. And she has a 1988 Jaguar she bought from an elderly friend of hers in 1990, and it's got 46,000 miles on it. She just never drives it. She has another car she drives for work. It's in spectacular condition. The guy who referred her to us as a service shop, she had $6,000 worth of work done 2 years ago. She's putting it in the sale, no reserve. It'll probably sell for $4,000. So when you think that car, you know, costs $60,000 new, and mechanically it's in excellent condition, the air conditioning blows cold. I mean, those are the kind of opportunities where it's hard to lose when you can buy something that's really, really reasonably priced. Will it come around and become a really big collectible? Probably not, because they made so many of them. But
Which model is it?
it's the second series of the XJ6, so 88, yeah. So,
I guess it's a lot of people, like, I've got a friend that's got a motorcycle in a box, a wood crate box, and he says if you open the box, it loses 50% of its value.
what kind is it?
You don't,
You don't know, you can't open a box.
it never opened the box. I mean, because it's never been opened, it's never been fired out or anything else.
So they haven't even put the handlebars on it yet, they're sitting sideways in the
You
box.
know, it's still in the box, and it hasn't had gas put in it, hasn't put oil put in it, nothing.
Well, that's pretty cool, you know,
I
so,
mean-
for the right weirdo, that would be over the
And it's
moon.
gotta be at least 40 years old or more. I mean, but he said, if I open a box, it loses 50% of
What
the
kind of
value.
motorcycle is it?
I hope he bought it himself new, because he might have bought a box of bolts for somebody else.
You never know.
You know, I don't think that it's that cut and dry, it's not that clear.
Well, are collectors that are investors, are they, that you talked about at the beginning, are they saying, buy me this car, store it for me, and 5 years from now I'll wholesale it and hope to make money? Or-
What they're doing is they're little thugs. So it's this guy that bought that Maserati from us for $100 grand. He probably has gone out there and raised $10 million or $20 million in this little hedge fund, and they're going out and buying cars without money and paying themselves a fee for doing it, and then saying at the end of this time period, we'll resell them and we'll get you some spread on them. And there's a lot of people doing that in New York in particular right now, with groups where they're just putting together a bunch of money and, you know, we're not doing anything in the stock market, we're not getting anything off of the rest of our portfolio, let's try this. And it has worked to some degree, but, you know, it's how much of it is a Madoff type deal, we won't know for a while until the market gets growing.
Because they're getting big regardless of whether or not they sell for a profit later on.
Right.
Their fees on top.
Well, yeah, because their fees are part of the deal, so they're really expecting it to grow. And, you know, there's just, for some people who aren't aware of the ebb and flow of what's happened before, it seems like a great deal to buy that Ferrari for only $2 million. There's only 100 of them, you know, but it's just, those numbers have never been realized before. So you take the example of the GTO, the guy that I used to work for sold one for a world record in '89 for under $50 million. The similar car was sold for 30 something. So, you know,
They were disappointed, weren't they? I thought they were hoping for 35.
they were disappointed.
Yeah.
Come on, just be happy. You know? Yeah.
Well, people were out buying 78 Corvette, the anniversary Corvettes, and putting them in the garage, and
Same
There's
thing
a million of them
with
out
the
there
80
now, aren't there?
MGBs, yeah. Everybody thought that last year MGB was gonna be their retirement.
so there's.
Or DeLoreans, you know, there's a lot of those kinds of cars. Those don't seem to have done much. I think a DeLorean is
Well,
an iconic car at some point, but it's still not.
But you can build your own DeLorean if you want.
Now you can, there's so many parts sitting around, yeah. So Stacy's got all kinds of little goodies back there if anybody wants one.
Let's give Evan a